The Sea Peoples. The collapse that erased an empire. Imagine this. The year is 1177 BC. Egypt is, by every measurable standard, the most powerful civilization on the face of the earth. Its pharaoh, Ramses III, commands the largest army in the ancient world. Its treasury holds more gold than any nation on the planet. Its temples rise so high they seem to compete with the sky itself. For over 3,000 years, through drought and war and plague, Egypt had endured, bending but never breaking, bleeding but never dying. 3,000 years. Let that number land for a moment. That is longer than the entire span of recorded Western history, from the fall of Rome to the present day. Egypt had already been old when the Greeks were still learning to write. Here is what makes the Bronze Age collapse one of the most terrifying events in all of human history. It was not a slow decline. It was not a gradual fading. Archaeologists digging in the ruins of Ugarit, once the most sophisticated trading port in the ancient Mediterranean, found a clay tablet with a half-finished letter still sitting in the kiln, as if the scribe had simply stood up, walked away, and never came back. The city burned shortly after. It was never rebuilt. Across the eastern Mediterranean, city after city simply went dark. Not conquered and repurposed, not absorbed into a new empire, dark. The palace at Mycenae, abandoned. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa, burned to ash. Cyprus, devastated. The diplomatic correspondence that once flowed between kings like a river. The tablets of the Amarna letters. Hundreds of messages between Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, and Assyria fell suddenly, completely silent. In a 30-year window between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC, the entire political and economic infrastructure of the ancient world collapsed simultaneously. Not a single ancient source records a victor. No empire rose from the ashes, crowing about its conquest. No king wrote boastfully of having brought down the old order. The world simply stopped. And the people who appeared in the wreckage, pouring out of the sea like a force of nature, carving through civilizations that had stood for millennia, were people whose true names we do not know to this day. We call them the Sea Peoples. And what they did to Egypt, and what Egypt did in return, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire human record. But to understand how an empire that had survived 3,000 years came within inches of annihilation, you first need to understand the world it lived in. The Late Bronze Age was, in many ways, the first globalized world in human history. We know this not from legend, but from evidence. In 1982, a shipwreck was discovered off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey. When archaeologists finished excavating it, they found aboard a single merchant vessel copper and tin ingots from Cyprus and Afghanistan, ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa, glass from Egypt, ivory from Syria, Canaanite wine jars, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian gold scarabs, and a set of writing tablets from a Canaanite merchant. This was not an unusual cargo. This was simply Tuesday in the Late Bronze Age. The Uluburan shipwreck carried goods from at least 7 distinct cultures across 3 continents, all on a single trading vessel dating to approximately 1300 BC. The great powers of this era, Egypt under the Ramessid pharaohs, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaean palace states of Greece, and the kingdom of Babylon did not merely trade with one another. They were deeply, systemically interdependent. Egypt had grain, the Hittites had iron, Cyprus had copper, the Mycenaeans had the ships and the sailors. Remove any one element from that equation, and the entire system began to strain. And here lies the seed of catastrophe. When you build your civilization on a network, when your economy depends on copper arriving from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain stored in palace granaries across Anatolia, you create something that is extraordinarily efficient in good times. Every node reinforces every other node. Prosperity compounds, cities grow, populations expand. But you also create something that is extraordinarily fragile in bad times. Modern economists have a term for this: systemic risk. The more tightly integrated a system becomes, the more a failure in one part of the network can cascade through the entire structure. The late Bronze Age civilizations had built something similar 3,000 years earlier, and they were about to discover its fatal weakness. Climate data from tree rings and lake sediment cores reveals a severe, multi-decade drought struck the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BC, the longest dry period in the region in over 3,000 years. The drought came first, then the famines, then the migrations. And out of those migrations, something unprecedented and terrifying began to coalesce on the edges of the known world. Here is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. We have extensive Egyptian records describing the Sea Peoples in vivid, dramatic detail, and yet we still do not know with certainty who they were or where they came from. The Egyptians gave them names: the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh. These names appear in carved inscriptions at Medinet Habu, in papyrus administrative records, in the great victory hymns of Ramses III. But here's the problem. None of these names correspond clearly to any civilization we can identify with confidence in the archaeological record. The Peliset may be the Philistines of later biblical tradition. The Danaan may be related to the Greeks. The Shekelesh may have come from Sicily. But every one of those connections is contested. What we can say with confidence is this: the Sea Peoples were not a single people. They were not an empire with a capital city, a unified command structure, and a grand strategic plan. They were something far more dangerous and far harder to defend against. They were a movement, a vast, desperate, multi-ethnic wave of displaced populations driven from their homelands by drought, famine, and the cascading collapse of the Bronze Age network itself. Every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean fell in their path before they reached Egypt. Think about what that means. These were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were not an army that had trained for years, assembled a war chest, and launched a calculated invasion of specific territory. They were something more like a tsunami, a force of nature set in motion by conditions no single person planned or controlled. We know from the Medinet Habu reliefs that the Sea Peoples traveled with their entire families. Ox carts packed with household goods, women, children, elderly. These were not soldiers on campaign. These were people who had nowhere to go back to. Their homelands were gone, burned, starved, or simply no longer viable. They were moving because staying still meant death. And their tactics reflected this. Where the great Bronze Age armies were built around discipline, hierarchy, and fixed formations, the Egyptian chariot corps, the Hittite infantry phalanx, the Sea Peoples were fluid, fast, and impossible to predict. They struck from the sea before defenders could organize. They melted back into the water before retaliation could be mounted. They operated in loose, semi-autonomous groups that could converge rapidly when opportunity presented itself and disperse just as quickly when conditions turned against them. They had, in the language of modern military theory, figured out asymmetric warfare. And the great powers of the Bronze Age, built for conflicts between peer competitors, had almost no doctrine for dealing with it. By the time the Sea Peoples reached Egypt's northern border, they had already destroyed the Hittite Empire, which at its height had been Egypt's only true military equal, the nation that had fought Ramses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh. Around 1177 BC, the Sea Peoples reached Egypt. They came in two columns simultaneously. One came overland from the north, through Canaan, moving south along the coast road that had for centuries been Egypt's primary route of imperial communication. The road along which Egyptian garrisons had once confidently maintained order across a vast empire. That empire was now largely gone. The garrisons were depleted or destroyed. The road now served as a highway of invasion. The second column came by sea, a vast armada of ships, carrying not just warriors, but the entirety of the Sea Peoples' world. Families, livestock, provisions, sailing directly toward the mouth of the Nile Delta. If they took the Delta, they took Egypt's agricultural heartland, the source of almost all of the nation's food production. Egypt would starve within a year. Ramses III understood this with terrible clarity. What he did next was, even by the standards of one of history's greatest military powers, remarkable. He reorganized, completely and rapidly. The traditional Egyptian military was built around the chariot, the high-technology weapon system of the Bronze Age. Fast, mobile, devastating against organized infantry, utterly useless against an enemy arriving by sea. Ramses could not fight the naval column with his chariot corps. He needed something different. The Medinet Habu inscriptions record that Ramses III deployed Egyptian warships armed with archers in a coordinated ambush, the earliest detailed naval battle in recorded history. Here is the tactical genius of what Ramses did, as recorded in the inscriptions and reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. He did not send his fleet out to meet the Sea Peoples in open water, where their superior seamanship and their complete lack of anything to lose would give them a decisive advantage. Instead, he lured them in. He positioned his warships inside the Nile Delta channels, in waters his navigators knew intimately, and the invaders did not. He lined the riverbanks with archers, thousands of them, many of them mercenaries drawn from the very same ethnic groups as the Sea Peoples themselves. Shurdan warriors who had been defeated in an earlier Egyptian campaign and absorbed into the pharaoh's army now turned against their former kin. He waited. When the Sea People's fleet entered the delta's channels, they found themselves sailing into a killing ground. From the banks, Egyptian archers fired into the crowded ships at close range. Egyptian vessels with grappling hooks pulled alongside the invaders' ships, and the fighting became hand-to-hand, boarding action by boarding action. The Sea People's ships, designed for open ocean, were difficult to maneuver in the narrow channels. One by one, they were disabled, captured, or sunk. The invaders who had swept away every other civilization on Earth were dragged from their ships, surrounded on the riverbanks, and cut down in the shallows. The great armada that had crossed the Mediterranean destroying kingdoms was broken apart in the narrow channels of the Nile Delta, trapped between archers firing from both banks and Egyptian warships closing from behind. Ship after ship was disabled, boarded, or sunk. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a systematic destruction. The land column was stopped simultaneously at the border of Canaan. Egyptian fortresses that Ramses had quietly reinforced held. The ground assault was broken. Egypt had won. The Sea Peoples had been turned back at the walls of the last great power standing. It was one of the most extraordinary military achievements in ancient history, and it cost Egypt everything. Ramses III returned to Thebes in triumph. He had the entire story carved in stone at Medinet Habu. Every ship, every prisoner, every detail of his magnificent victory. He received tribute. He performed the rituals. He declared that the gods had saved Egypt through his hand. He was not wrong. But the world that Ramses returned to was not the world he had inherited. The trade routes were gone. The great Canaanite city-states that had served as intermediaries in Egypt's commercial empire had been overrun. Archaeological evidence shows that Egyptian imports of foreign luxury goods dropped by approximately 90% in the decades following 1177 BC. The international system that had sustained Bronze Age prosperity simply ceased to function. Egypt had won the battle and lost the world. In the years that followed Ramses III's victory, a remarkable administrative papyrus was discovered, now known as the Harris Papyrus, the longest surviving papyrus from ancient Egypt. It catalogs in exhaustive detail the pharaoh's gifts to the temples, his military campaigns, his building projects. It reads like the record of a great empire at its height. But read carefully between the lines, and a different picture emerges. The treasury is under strain. Military campaigns are increasingly about suppressing internal instability rather than projecting external power. The mercenary soldiers, including former Sea Peoples who had been absorbed into Egypt's army, just as Ramses had used them in the Delta battle, were growing restless. Their pay was late. Their grain rations had been cut. Ordinary workers striking because the state could not feed them. This was Egypt in the years after its greatest military triumph. The end, when it came for Ramses III personally, was operatic in its darkness. His own wives and court officials conspired to assassinate him in what Egyptologists call the harem conspiracy. The plotters were numerous, the planning was elaborate, and the motivation was the scramble for position in a court that everyone could sense was losing its grip. Forensic examination of Ramses III's mummy, conducted in 2012, confirmed that his throat was cut almost to the spine. He died in the darkness, in his own palace, killed by the people closest to him. Egypt continued technically as Egypt. The Ramessid dynasty staggered on through several more pharaohs. But the empire that had made Egypt great contracted year by year, decade by decade, like a tide going out and never fully returning. The New Kingdom, the period of Egypt's greatest power, effectively ended within a century of the Sea People's assault. Not because Egypt was conquered, not because its culture was destroyed or its gods were overthrown, but because the system that had sustained Egyptian power had been so severely damaged by the Bronze Age collapse that Egypt could never fully repair it. A civilization that survives a catastrophe is not necessarily a civilization that recovers from one. The sea is never quiet, and the doors of history are never locked forever. The Bronze Age collapse did not end history. It broke one version of the world, and in the wreckage, allowed another to begin. The question is not whether that can happen again. The question is whether we are paying enough attention to recognize it when it does. 3,000 years from now, if some future civilization sifts through the wreckage of our own era, what will they find half-finished in the kiln? What message will they read, interrupted, and wonder at? That is not a comfortable question, but it is the right one. And it is the question that the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples, those nameless ghosts from the Mediterranean, forces us to ask of ourselves. History is not something that happened to other people in distant times. It is the operating manual of the human condition. And right now, 3,000 years after Ramses III stood on the shores of the Nile Delta and watched the horizon fill with enemy sails, the manual is open to a page that looks uncomfortably familiar.